So, our special guest today is Elizabeth J. Brown. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in writing horror.
So, I am a dark fantasy horror author, and I always wanted to write something, and it was always going to end up being dark because I was just one of those children who liked all the spooky and creepy things, staying inside, shying away from sunlight. I think people were convinced I was a vampire for quite a while. And as I said, I always wanted to write a book. Never really got beyond a few chapters. I even signed myself up for a creative writing course, did that, and then did nothing with it. And life goes on like it does. I got married, got a house, had my son. And it was when I was on maternity leave that I was sitting there. We've got one of those Alexa devices. And I asked it to play children's music, which it did. And it was cycling through the usual Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and all the rest of it. And then all of a sudden, it would play The Laughing Policeman, which is a creepy song in itself. And it was so out of place with all these children's songs. And I started listening to the lyrics, and they are creepy as well. I started thinking, why would there be this policeman, and why would he be laughing until his jaw snapped, and what's going on there? And it planted the germ of this idea, which grew and grew. And I thought, I would like to write this. And then I just decided that if I didn't sit down and write something, I was going to carry on just wanting to write a book. So that's what I did. I was working at the time. So it'd be when I got home and on the weekends, I started writing this book. And eventually at the end of it, I actually had a finished draft. And then once I'd redrafted it a couple of times, I looked for an editor, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah. And how's it doing for you?
It's good. Yeah. So when I wrote it, I didn't actually set out to write horror because it was always going to be dark, like I said, but I didn't specifically think, I wanted to write a horror book. So when it was out, it was, like I say, I call it dark fantasy horror because there's a lot of fantasy elements in it. And initially I thought, it's fancy, but it's a bit gory. And then I realized eventually that actually it was more horror. And so I leaned in more towards the horror community where everybody sort of accepted me. And it's a wonderful, wonderful community to be part of. There's a Facebook group called Books of Horror, which is phenomenal. And in there, I've found loads of readers, loads of fellow authors who are now my friends. And it's just been brilliant.
Yeah, I know it's a very friendly community. I'm doing a book signing event, and I believe you're coming to that.
I am, yes.
With a few others.
Yeah, I think all us horror authors are hijacking that event.
That's fine. Okay, so how do you create your characters to make them scary and really relatable?
I like flawed characters, so I've always liked the villains and the anti-heroes. When I was a kid, I used to read comic books, specifically sort of X-Men, and my favorite character was Wolverine because he's this anti-hero. He's got sort of dark bits to his character, but he has a good heart, and they're the sort of characters I like. So the protagonists all have flaws, but also the antagonists are not purely one-dimensional sort of evil people. I like to make them at least vaguely sort of relatable and human so that you can understand why the characters are doing the things they're doing, whether the things they are doing are good or the things they are doing are bad.
You base off any personal experiences or people that you know?
Not really. So my dad was a detective in the police, so I leaned heavily on him for advice about the procedure, because the start of the book is set in the 1980s, which is when my dad was in the police. So I got to grill him as part of my research into what things were like back then. So hopefully it's realistic. I had him read it over, but the characters aren't based on anyone in particular. They're sort of an amalgamation of just anybody you'd meet in real life. And I guess you probably do absorb a bit of your friends and relatives and yourself into all of your characters, but hopefully they're relatable enough that anybody could read it and go, oh, I see myself in that person. Maybe that's based on me.
Yeah. Fantastic. So are you a plotter or a pantser?
I am most definitely a plotter. My first outline for The Laughing Policeman, I think, was about 22,000 words, which is almost a novella in itself. And I did try. So I thought I'd written The Laughing Policeman. And I also wrote a prequel novella set in the 17th century about a young boy. But because I'd written the novella and I'd written the novel, I thought with the next book, which is the sequel to The Laughing Policeman, I know what I'm doing. I don't need to have a 22,000 word outline. I'll just write and I'll see where it takes me. I'll do a little bit of how I want it to go and that'll be it. I've got maybe a third to a half of the way in and just got stuck and realised from that point, actually, I did need an outline, and I'm just one of those people who needs to know where it is I'm going. I like to say it's sort of like a map. As long as I know how to get from point A to point B, it doesn't really matter which route I take and whether I stray a bit, but I'll know how to get there. But yeah, I am most definitely a plotter.
Do you do the same with your characters as well? Do you plot the characters?
I do have little character sheets, so as well as their physical descriptions, that I don't accidentally change their height or eye colour or something halfway through. I like to give them the sort of backstories and maybe personality traits and weaknesses and idiosyncrasies. So I do have character sheets and outlines and questions for each chapter. I like to break the outlines down by chapter. So at the end of each chapter, I'll have a series of questions to try and ask myself why they're doing what they're doing, how it's going to progress in the next point, and it just helps me tie everything together.
Yeah. So what's been the hardest part about writing for horror?
Writing for horror, as I say, because I didn't come from necessarily the mindset of it being horror, I think it has all the elements of horror, but it could also be called more dark fantasy because there is gore, there are murders, there is tension and things like that, but it's not what you would call a slasher or your traditional possession story or anything like that. So I think some of it is because possibly I haven't hit those major horror tropes that it would be seen more as dark fantasy, but a lot of the books I enjoy are sort of darker fantasy. Although I watch a lot of horror films, for some reason I didn't read that much horror. I would read fantasy and grimdark, and it was only really after I released The Laughing Policeman that I became more immersed in the horror community and reading horror books. And I couldn't tell you why. I think it's because when you're at school, you have to read certain books as part of the curriculum. And I think it put me off reading anything for a while. And the thing that got me back into reading was Terry Pratchett.
Yeah.
So I liked his characters like Death and all the rest of them. And that's what I was building. But because, like I say, I also love horror films, I wanted to sort of blend the two together. But in terms of writing in general, the thing that I find hard is probably sitting down and making sure I actually write. There's so much going on when you're doing self-publishing with marketing and doing all the other bits that are part of publishing and advertising, and also the fact that I've got a young son and a home life. It's just carving out that time to actually sit down and do some writing, I think, is probably the hardest. And also because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, I find it really difficult not to edit as I go along.
Yeah.
So I have to remind myself just to finish the first draft and then I can edit it afterwards.
Yeah, I think with horror, there's that many subgenres at the moment, and there's new ones coming out, that the typical tropes that were, then they're still there, but there are hundreds of other tropes coming around, isn't there? So something that would be classed as dark fantasy, it is sort of like crossing over the genres now, isn't it? And becoming horror.
Yes, what I find quite interesting, because I did a little Google on it a while ago about what is the difference between dark fantasy and horror. And apparently it was, I think, in the sort of 80s and 90s where you had all the big sort of horror authors and horror became really popular. And then from, I think, the traditional publishing point of view, it started to wane a bit. So they decided to rebrand horror as dark fantasy or dark fantasy horror. But according to some people, it's pretty much the same thing. I like to think of it as just sort of horror with fantasy elements, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's such a broad subject, isn't it? Horror. It fits into almost anything. I mean, you've got your paranormal romance as well, so you can do anything with horror.
That's true. I mean, horror, it doesn't necessarily have to be monsters or things like that. It could be psychological.
You're back with us.
I am. Yes, I don't know what happened there. I heard you say hello and then it just sort of disappeared.
Yeah, you went all quiet. You was talking and then all of a sudden it just went all quiet.
It's probably, I have not the best internet connection around here, so it could be that.
It's fine. It's no problem. Okay, so what was the most difficult scene that you've ever had to write?
I think possibly there is without giving anything away, there's a funeral scene within The Laughing Policeman where one of the characters is giving a eulogy. And I found that quite difficult just because I wanted the character to have this sort of emotional speech, but it still had to sort of align with that particular character and their quirks, and also be enough to try and make the reader have an emotional connection, but without going over the top. In fact, I ended up skipping that chapter for a bit, carrying on with the rest of it, and then going back to redo that chapter at the end just so that I could fit it in.
Yeah. And did you manage to get it all the way that you wanted to in the end, that you was 100% happy with?
Yeah, I managed to get it there. It's just this particular character is sort of one of those people who is sort of emotionally repressed. So they had this other character was close to them. And obviously you're trying to balance, trying to get your emotional speech out there, but you being not very comfortable with your emotions. But I think it's true to the character and I'm happy with it, how it turned out.
Yeah. So have you had any memorable feedback from readers?
I've had loads of nice reviews. I've had made lots of friends. I see familiar faces with my readers now, which is lovely. And I have a readers group where you see all the familiar faces popping up and saying hello. And I think probably the most memorable bits is when I've had a few messages with people saying how much they enjoyed the book and that I'm now one of their favourite authors. And I think that's just lovely. When you set out to write a book, you're always afraid of how it's going to be received and whether anybody is actually going to like it. But ranking somebody's top list is just a wonderful feeling.
Do you sit there reading the reviews?
I do. I know you're not supposed to read your reviews, but I do read the reviews. Sometimes I'll read the negative ones because if you do get negative reviews and there is valid feedback, there could be something that you can learn from that. And as I say, if it's valid, you can apply it to work going forward. A lot of it, you seem to get a few trolls, or people will give you negative feedback for the most random reasons. I think one of my 2-star reviews that I've got is actually a really, really nice review. It's them saying how much they enjoyed the first part of the book, but then it became too violent for them, and that they would read anything else I wrote as long as it wasn't that violent. So I think that was a 2-star, but I thought actually that's quite a nice 2-star review.
Yeah, I'd take that one as a plus.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it does, when you do get a new 1-star or a 2-star or whatever, it does get you down a bit. But then I like to either read some of the 5 stars because they make me smile, or I will go and find my favourite book by my favourite author, somebody who I think, that is the level of writing I want to achieve. And I'll go and look at their 1 stars just to make me sort of feel, well, this is a book that I think is right up there, and you still get people who don't like it. And it just, for some reason, sort of puts it into perspective that you can't please everybody.
You can't. That's the thing, isn't it, with reviews? You get your 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s and 5 stars, but you have to sort of like sit back and think, you can't please everybody. Not everyone is going to like the book.
No. And that's fine, because you will find your readers. Your readers are the people who will love the book. And then there are people who will pick up your book and they are just not your readers. They'll pick up your book, they'll try it. And if they try it, it's still great that they tried it. And like I said, if they give you valid feedback for why they don't like it, then it's something to learn from. But like we said, you can't please everybody, and that's fine. Not everybody likes the same thing, and it would be pretty boring if everybody did.
So have you got any exciting projects that you're currently working on? I know you said you were working on another book, but you are kind of stuck with it at the moment.
So I am working on the sequel to my novella, The Foundling. So I have a free book that's available to download from my website when you sign up to my newsletter, which is called The Foundling. And it is set within the same universe as The Laughing Policeman, but just hundreds of years in the past. And they do eventually tie together. And if you've read both of them, you may have picked up a name from the two of them, and it becomes more apparent if you read the sequel to The Laughing Policeman as well. But I want to write the sequel to that, but because it is set so far back in the past, I like it to be as historically accurate as it can be, even though it is fantasy. Yeah. And I decided in my infinite wisdom to have this one start from them sailing from England to France. And then I realised that actually, if I wanted to have a scene with them on the boat, I would need to do research about the boat. And you can't always find everything or answers that agree with one another when you're trying to research stuff. So I have bought myself a few books on boats and crossing the channel in like the 17 and 1800s. So I've got to have a little look through those.
Yeah.
So I did pause that for a little bit, but I would like to finish that. That's going to be another novella, but I also have to outline the third book in the series. And I also decided at the same time I wanted to run a sister series that goes in parallel to this book, because I don't have enough to do.
Yeah. That's the thing, isn't it? especially with authors, we get all these ideas, put them on pieces of paper or on our computers, and we try to get them all done at the same time.
I know, so many notebooks everywhere with ideas.
Fantastic. So, what advice would you give to somebody who is starting out to become an author?
Right. I think that's where a lot of people fall down, is you are trying to get what's in your head on the page, and it doesn't always translate well. So you write a paragraph, you might write a page, you might write a chapter, and it won't be exactly what you want it to be. So you'll be tempted to go back and rewrite it until it's perfect. And if you do that, you're never going to finish. So my advice would be just write and finish your first draft. You can always edit a first draft. You can't edit a blank piece of paper. Yeah. And that, I think, is advice I'd give to myself as well. I need to get the first drafts finished, and you tidy up from there. So yeah, my advice would be just keep writing and get that first draft finished.
Fantastic. So where can we find your books, Elizabeth?
So my novella, The Foundling, is available as a free digital download from my website, which is elizabethjbrown.com. You can also buy it from my store, which is linked on that website. The Laughing Policeman and The Foundling, the ebook is exclusive to Amazon, but you can buy the paperbacks and hardbacks from any bookstore. Physical ones, you may have to request they order it in for you, and libraries as well. And I have just this week had my audiobook for The Laughing Policeman go live, and that is exclusive to Audible.
Fantastic. Are you still with us?
I am, yes.
So you've gone
Just keeping you on your toes.
Yeah. Okay, that's brilliant. Well, it's been lovely having you on the show, Elizabeth. So thank you for accepting my invite to come on and discuss your, obviously being an author, and your Laughing Policeman and The Foundling. It's wonderful.
Thank you for having me, and for sticking with me even when my internet decides to give up the ghost.
No, that's fine. Don't worry. Okay.